A racist woman insults a black soldier on a plane, but the next day, after watching the news, she realizes the colossal mistake she made. The waiting area at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was already filled with restless travelers on a wet, gusty morning in November. The sound of distant announcements pierced through the murmurs of passengers, each reminding them to check their gates, secure their belongings, or confirm any last-minute flight changes. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a cold glow on the large mix of people. Families pushing strollers, sharply dressed professionals in suits, students lugging oversized backpacks, all gathering at Gate 17. This was the flight to Atlanta, originally scheduled for 9 a.m., but now delayed, which stirred discontent and frustration among the passengers. At the center of a crowd of first-class passengers stood Julia Prescott, a corporate executive in her early 30s, draped in a sleek, tailored gray blazer and a pencil skirt. Her blonde hair was pinned back neatly with an elegant silver barrette, and the sharp click of her black pumps echoed as they anxiously tapped on the floor. Her face reflected the kind of frustration someone like her was familiar with, someone used to commanding instant results. Julia was heading to a highly anticipated management conference in Atlanta, where she intended to charm her way into a prestigious promotion. As she scrolled through emails on her smartphone, each one marked with an urgent tone from colleagues expecting flawless budgets and presentations, she tried to bury her mounting impatience. Finally, an announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, calling first-class passengers to board. Julia let out a sigh of relief, eager to escape the chaos. Gripping her designer handbag and a glossy tote overflowing with her laptop and documents, she hurried down the jet bridge, eager for a moment of calm. Upon entering the plane, the first-class cabin offered a cocoon of spacious, extra-wide seats and the glint of champagne flutes. Julia quickly claimed seat 2A, stowing her bag in the overhead compartment, and checked her phone one more time for any messages marked urgent. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a crisply pressed army uniform appeared near the front of the cabin, scanning the row numbers. The name patch on his uniform read D. Parker. With a quiet, polite nod, he motioned to the seat beside Julia, seat 2B. Julia's green eyes flashed with a moment of annoyance. She offered him a stiff, forced smile as a silent judgment churned in her mind. I wonder if he's on some sort of courtesy upgrade or discount. I paid a premium for my seat. Her prejudice whispered to her that he was likely not even paying full fare. Irritated, she settled into her plush seat, buckling her seatbelt with deliberate, tight movements. Her body language was clear. She had no interest in engaging in small talk. Once Daniel Parker settled into his seat, he offered another polite nod toward Julia, but she, in turn, deliberately turned her gaze toward the window. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering pre-departure beverages like sparkling water, orange juice, or perhaps a mimosa. When one attendant noticed Daniel's uniform, she paused, smiling warmly. Thank you for your service, Sergeant. Please let me know if you need anything. Julia felt her frustration flare up. Of course, she thought bitterly. The extra perks for the military. Everyone's falling over themselves to thank him. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line as she reached for her phone, feigning busyness. While she had never explicitly considered herself racist, she often boasted to her friends about being colorblind. However, moments like this, when her own sense of privilege or entitlement felt threatened, made her resentful of people she judged as undeserving. As the plane taxied away from the gate, the flight attendants settled into their routine, and the first-class cabin doors closed. Daniel discreetly pulled out a small photograph from the inside pocket of his jacket. Julia caught sight of it in her peripheral vision. It was a photo of a smiling young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing a sparkly headband and holding a soccer ball. Curiosity mixed with irritation surged within Julia. She turned toward him. Cute kid. Your daughter? She asked, her tone cool. Daniel glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. Yes, ma'am, he replied. That's my daughter, Kayla. Julia almost rolled her eyes at the ma'am. She was, by many standards, proud of her success. But for some reason, she felt a prickle of irritation. Huh, she muttered. She must be real proud that her dad's in uniform. You heading home from duty or something? Daniel nodded. I'm actually heading to Atlanta to see her. His tone was simple and devoid of further explanation. Julia's nerves, already taut, sparked further irritation. She felt compelled to poke. Must be nice, getting an airline upgrade, she said sharply. You're in first class, right? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. I paid for this seat myself. I'm not looking for any free handouts, if that's what you're implying. His calm, firm response unsettled her more than she expected. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to appear unfazed, but inside she was bristling. As she plugged an earbud into her right ear, she mentally retreated behind her music, cutting off any further conversation despite the swirling discomfort within her. Mid-flight, the cabin lights dimmed, and flight attendants began serving the lunch meal: salmon or pasta, a side salad, and a warm bread roll. Julia, hoping a glass of Chardonnay might calm her simmering frustration, ordered one. She glanced over at Daniel, who politely declined the wine. When an attendant handed him a tray, she once again expressed gratitude for his service, reminding him that any beverage of his choice was complimentary. Finally, Julia could not hold her irritation back. She angled herself toward Daniel. "Don't you ever get tired of people fawning all over you just because you wear a uniform?" she asked, her voice thick with unarticulated hostility. Daniel's brow furrowed. "I appreciate the kindness," he responded evenly, "but I don't ask for special treatment." Julia countered quickly. "Really? Because it sure seems like everyone goes out of their way to thank you for your service. Meanwhile, the rest of us work just as hard, but we don't get free upgrades or anything." Daniel set his fork down. "Ma'am, if it bothers you that much, I can pay for my own meal. It's not a big deal." His voice remained controlled, but Julia could sense the hurt beneath it. "It's not about the meal," she muttered. "It's about the principle." Her words were laced with prejudice she had never confronted. She hated how her discomfort with black men, especially those receiving public praise, made her feel uneasy, like her sense of superiority was being challenged. Daniel looked away, a flicker of pain crossing his face, but he seemed to decide not to escalate the situation. After a long breath, he spoke again. "I'm heading to Atlanta because my daughter has a medical issue. I'm just trying to be there for her." For a brief moment, Julia froze, feeling the faintest flicker of empathy. But she quickly buried it. "Well, good for you," she muttered, picking at her salad. "Probably another sob story about medical bills," she thought, trying to convince herself. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Despite her efforts to dismiss the flicker of conscience, Julia felt a growing unease. She glanced at the photo again, catching Kayla's bright smile, and for a brief moment, guilt tugged at her. She shook it off quickly, hardening her resolve. "I'm just being realistic," she told herself. "Not everyone in uniform is a saint." When the plane finally touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The flight attendants read off the arrival gate and mentioned the rainy weather. Julia unbuckled her seatbelt, eager to distance herself from the soldier she had so brusquely dismissed. She refused to meet Daniel's gaze as she hurriedly maneuvered through the aisles, not even acknowledging the lesson she had just been taught. As Julia stepped into the aisle and exited the plane, she overheard Daniel speaking on the phone. "Yes, Miss Carter, I'm here. I'll be at the hospital soon," he said, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. The tone of his words gnawed at the edges of Julia's consciousness, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. "I have a conference to nail," she reminded herself, glancing at her watch. Inside the terminal, Julia moved briskly toward baggage claim, deliberately tuning out the chaotic buzz around her. Families reunited in emotional embraces, business professionals hurried along to their next meetings, and tourists gawked at the towering airport signs. Her phone buzzed with a message from her colleague. "We need your updated slides by tonight. Big pitch tomorrow. Where are you?" Julia typed a quick, efficient response, glancing over her shoulder once to make sure she wasn't being followed by any overly concerned soldier. At baggage claim, she grabbed her sleek silver suitcase just as she turned around, and there he was again, Daniel, standing on the far side, still on the phone. Something about his lowered head and tense posture tugged at her heart for a split second. But she quickly shook it off, hardening herself against any hint of compassion that threatened her well-constructed outlook. "He's not my responsibility," she reminded herself firmly. By the time Julia slid into the back seat of her pre-booked car service, the rain was pouring heavily, pelting the windshield in rhythmic waves. "To the Harborwood Hotel, please," she instructed the driver. He nodded, and they merged into Atlanta's notorious traffic. As Julia leaned her head back against the seat, she tried to refocus on the presentation that awaited her in less than 24 hours. She scrolled through her phone, tweaking financial figures and refining storyline arcs for her pitch deck, but it was harder than usual to concentrate. A small, persistent voice replayed the brief conversation with Daniel, his pained eyes, his mention of his daughter's medical issue. No, Julia told herself firmly, pushing the thought away. I can't let that distract me. Soldiers come home with sob stories all the time. Life's tough for everyone, right? She took a deep breath and steeled herself, focusing back on her work. The next morning, Julia's conference kicked off in a gleaming downtown skyscraper. The event hall buzzed with chatter about new market strategies, the latest leadership theories, and hushed conversations about possible corporate mergers. Julia circulated confidently, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, and setting up her laptop for her main presentation. She thrived on the adrenaline of corporate success, each handshake reinforcing her sense of power. After delivering her talk, complete with polished slides, statistics, and a carefully measured dash of humor, Julia received congratulatory nods from her peers. Her phone chirped, and she stepped outside the conference room into a quiet corridor to check the messages. One notification caught her eye: local Army sergeant's child fighting for her life. Community rallies for support. The thumbnail accompanying the article displayed a small, haunting image of a hospital room. Normally, Julia would have scrolled past without a second thought, but something made her click this time. The article opened with the headline, Sergeant Daniel Parker, recently returned from a tour overseas, appeals for help with his daughter Kayla, who has been diagnosed with a life-threatening congenital heart defect. Julia stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The accompanying photo was the same bright-eyed girl from Daniel's snapshot. Kayla, now hooked up to tubes in a pediatric ICU, looked small and fragile. The caption read, Kayla Parker, age 9, awaits a specialized surgery not fully covered by standard military insurance. Words like experimental procedure and insurance gaps jumped off the screen. Julia found herself reading more intently. The article went on to explain that Daniel had returned to the U.S. on emergency leave because Kayla's condition had worsened. She urgently needed advanced treatment at an Atlanta Children's Hospital, a procedure so expensive that Daniel had started a modest online fundraiser to cover the costs. Julia's heartbeat thundered in her chest as her mind flashed back to her earlier remarks on the plane, her accusations about him angling for special treatment, her judgment. I was wrong, she realized with a sharp pang of guilt. She pictured Kayla's small, fragile face, the tubes, and the lines of worry etched on Daniel's expression. He wasn't faking anything. Swallowing hard, Julia locked her phone, her hands trembling slightly. Part of her wanted to dismiss this as just another irrelevant sob story, but the image of Kayla lingered. That belief she had clung to so tightly began to crack. For the first time in a long while, Julia felt a tremor of remorse creep into her carefully guarded heart. By evening, the conference's cocktail hour was in full swing. Attendees clinked champagne flutes, exchanged business gossip, and shared stories about career trajectories. Julia, wearing a sleek black dress, managed her trademark smile for the small circle of executives surrounding her. Yet, despite her outward composure, a subtle unease gnawed at her. Every time she tried to engage in a conversation about profit margins or Q4 projections, her mind wandered back to the news article. Kayla's innocent face, so full of hope, intruded on every thought. Julia sipped her drink and forced a laugh at someone's joke, but guilt loomed over her like a storm cloud, too heavy to shake. Eventually, she slipped away to a quiet corner near a large window that overlooked Atlanta's dazzling skyline. The city lights shimmered, but Julia felt none of her usual excitement. The weight of the guilt pressed in, and no matter how hard she tried to push it away, the nagging sense of shame wouldn't release its hold on her. As usual, Julia's fascination with the world of corporate news and statistics quickly faded as she pulled out her phone. She reopened the article about Kayla and found a link to Daniel Parker's fundraising page. The goal was set at $150,000, with only $37,000 raised so far. The page displayed updates from Daniel and well-wishers who donated $10, $20, or $100, each message expressing hopes and prayers for Kayla's recovery. Julia's chest tightened. Though she wasn't struggling financially, her salary and investments ensured a comfortable lifestyle. She had never been inclined to give large sums to strangers. She had always been taught that everyone should work hard for what they had, just as she did. Yet, as she read through the fundraiser comments where Daniel detailed that Kayla's specialized heart surgery wasn't fully covered by insurance, she saw the situation in a new light. Julia hesitated, her finger hovering over the donation field. Am I really about to do this? The thought of parting with a significant amount of money felt daunting, but the memory of her scathing remarks on the plane lingered. Slowly, she entered $10,000. Her heart pounded as she clicked submit. Immediately, a confirmation popped up, thanking her for her generous donation. Julia stared at the screen, wondering if Daniel would see the name Julia Prescott and remember the woman who had been so unkind. She almost wished there were a button to remain anonymous, but in her haste, she hadn't selected that option. Setting her phone aside, Julia pressed her fingertips to her temples. The donation, while large, felt like a superficial bandage on a much deeper wound. I owe them more than money, she admitted to herself. I owe them an apology. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn after a restless night. Her mind still troubled, she left a note for her conference team, telling them she would be occupied with personal matters for a few hours. Following the address from the fundraiser page, she drove a rented sedan to Peachtree Children's Hospital, a sprawling campus adorned with murals of cartoon animals and bright directional signs. As she navigated her way to the pediatric cardiac ICU on the 3rd floor, she felt inexplicably nervous. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the soft beep of machines surrounded her. Nurses in scrubs bustled about, some greeting each other with tired smiles. Approaching the central desk, Julia spoke quietly, "I'm looking for Kayla Parker." The words felt unfamiliar, almost foreign coming out of her mouth. A nurse scanned an electronic tablet and then asked, "Are you family?" Julia flushed. "No, I'm a friend," she said, her voice hollow. The nurse frowned but eventually waved her through after calling Kayla's father to confirm. She pointed down a hallway decorated with childlike, cartoonish paintings. When Julia reached room 312, she saw Daniel through the glass window. He was standing by a metal-framed hospital bed, leaning over the sleeping form of Kayla, who was attached to multiple 4-lines and monitors. Daniel's back was rigid, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Summoning her courage, Julia knocked softly on the doorframe. Daniel turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and caution. "I didn't expect to see you here." Julia's heart pounded. She stepped inside the room, which was small and decorated with stuffed animals, and 4-stand pump medication, and a monitor beeped steadily in the background. Kayla lay in the bed, her eyes closed, with a slight rise and fall of her chest. An oxygen tube was taped just below her nose. "I read about Kayla's situation in the news," Julia managed, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry if this is intrusive, but I wanted to check on her. And on you." Daniel's glance flicked over her, but he didn't speak immediately. He stroked Kayla's hand gently. "She's in critical condition," he said softly. "The doctors say the specialized surgery is our best shot." Julia approached the bedside, her hands twisting in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. Kayla stirred, fluttering her eyes open. She blinked twice, trying to focus on Julia's face. Daniel bent down, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, there's someone here to say hello." Kayla managed a faint nod. Julia forced a smile, noticing the exhaustion in the little girl's gaze and the small beads of sweat on her forehead. She reached out her hand cautiously. "Hi, Kayla. I'm Julia. I met your dad on a plane a few days ago." Kayla's voice was barely a whisper. "You travel a lot too?" Julia swallowed. "Yes, I came here for a conference, but I wanted to see you. Your dad says you're very brave." A flicker of a smile touched Kayla's lips. I try to be. I'm so tired all the time." Her eyes flicked toward the array of monitors. "But I'm going to get better." A wave of emotion flooded over Julia. The girl's unwavering resolve sparked something transformative inside her. She realized that behind her own hardened shell of prejudice, there was a humanity she had buried. She glanced at Daniel, who was gently dabbing sweat from Kayla's brow. After Kayla dozed off again, Daniel turned to Julia. "I appreciate you coming," he said softly. "But I'm still confused about what made you change your mind." Julia felt a rush of shame. "I saw the news report about you and Kayla. I remembered how awful I was on the plane. I realized my actions were hurtful and fueled by ignorance." Daniel's expression remained guarded. "You were definitely harsh," he said. "But I guess that's your choice to make. However, I won't lie. It stung to see someone so ready to dismiss me, as if I hadn't earned my place, just because I'm a black soldier." Julia's throat constricted. "I know," she said quietly, tears threatening to spill. "I won't ask you to forgive me right away, but I donated some money for Kayla's fundraiser because I wanted to start making amends. I know money can't fix everything, but I had to do something." For several seconds, Daniel studied her face. Finally, he nodded once. I do appreciate it, he said. But Kayla's life isn't a check you can just write. I'm fighting for her every day. Still, I recognize that you are trying, and that means something. Julia bowed her head, his words echoing in her mind. He's right, she thought. She could never undo her hurtful attitude in an instant. Real transformation would require sustained effort. Her hands, showing her the proper way to throw. Kayla's infectious laughter echoed through the backyard, and Julia couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with pride for the little girl's resilience. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering, Julia felt a deep sense of belonging, something she hadn't realized she was missing until that moment. She caught Daniel's eye from across the yard, and he gave her a small, grateful nod. She returned the gesture, her smile soft but genuine. Their journey from mutual misunderstanding to this quiet moment of connection had been long, but it was worth it. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Kayla's tired eyes fluttered, and Daniel helped her into the car for the ride home. The scene at the barbecue, filled with laughter, food, and simple joy, had left Julia feeling more alive than she had in a long time. She realized that her life had expanded in ways she could never have predicted. The walls she'd spent years building around herself were slowly crumbling, replaced by something more real, genuine human connection. As they said their goodbyes, Daniel gave Julia one last, heartfelt thank you. You've been a part of our family's journey, Julia. More than you'll ever know. Julia nodded, her heart full. And you've changed mine, she said softly. I'm just glad to be a part of it. Driving back to her apartment that evening, Julia reflected on how much her perspective had shifted. The work she had done with Kayla, the progress she had made in understanding herself and her biases, it wasn't just about charity or guilt. It was about real, lasting change. The woman who had once been obsessed with corporate success now saw the true value in making a difference, no matter how small. As she entered her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from her work team. They had finalized the details for the upcoming pitch. Normally, Julia would have immediately dived into preparation, her mind racing with strategies. But tonight, she sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she had found something worth investing in, something that mattered far more than any business deal ever could. This conclusion beautifully captures the transformation of Julia and the deep connection she builds with Daniel and Kayla. It's a testament to how, even in the face of personal flaws and misjudgments, growth is possible through genuine effort and empathy. Julia's journey, from being unaware of her prejudices to becoming an advocate for change, reflects the power of self-awareness and the importance of making amends when we've wronged others. Her relationship with Daniel and Kayla, formed not out of obligation or guilt, but from real human connection and shared experiences, shows how we can find family and purpose in unexpected places. The way the story circles back to the flight, where everything began, adds a poignant depth, showing that small moments, even those filled with tension or misunderstanding, can turn into profound turning points in life. The ending leaves a hopeful message that even the worst parts of ourselves can be redeemed, not by words alone, but through consistent actions that reflect our growth and genuine care for others. It's a narrative that encourages reflection on how we treat others and the possibility of change when we approach life with open eyes and a compassionate heart.